ask you, when you're writing a series, at
Yeah.
what point in the process do you know that this is a premise book for a series versus this is a standalone?
It's a good question. When I wrote the first Charlie Joe Jackson book, since I didn't really know what I was doing,
Best way to get it done?
best way to get it done. My agent sent it and said, "Well, I'm going to try to get a 2-book contract out of this, and maybe the second book will be a sequel, and maybe it won't." And I said, "Wow," I said what anybody would say, which is great. Do what you have to do. I'd love to get my book published. And they bought it as a you don't really call 2 books a series, but as a book and a sequel. And I didn't really know what how that was going to work. I hadn't written the first book with a lead into a second story at all. It felt all encompassing to me when I had first written it. So when I found out there was going to be a sequel, I went back and kind of developed almost as if I was writing a new standalone book as opposed to a direct sequel. I mean, it had the characters, but Charlie Joe Jackson's Guide to Extra Credit could have been a first book in a series. It wasn't relying on anything that had happened in the first book. It's the premise of that one is that his grades are terrible and his parents are threatening him to send him to this academic summer camp unless he doesn't get his grades up. And so he joins all these extra credit things in school to try to get his grades up. And it was halfway through writing that second book where I think the numbers of the first book were promising enough that my publisher, Macmillan, told us that they were going to want a couple more Charlie Joe Jackson books past the second one, a third and a fourth. And they didn't know at that point how many. And so it was in the middle of writing the second book where I realized I need to figure out a way to make this kind of open-ended so that it could last, which is how I kind of came up with the idea of he having to go to this camp, and the third book then takes place in the camp. And then ultimately, I can't remember, 4 or 5 books in, I started really struggling with ways to keep these characters fresh, because when I first heard that this was going to be a sequel, I devised this whole kind of 5-book plan where each book would take place in the next grade up. This was how naive I was. And I said, well, this first book could be in 6th grade and then 7th grade, and then ultimately they'll graduate from high school. And again, it was one of those pat me on the head moments. And they're like, oh, Tommy, you don't know anything. That's not how this works. They
wouldn't try that today, not now that you're the Tommy Greenwald. Back then, they could get away with it.
No one's patting this guy on the head anymore. So they basically said, no, they're like cartoon characters. They don't age. They can age, they can refer back to something that happened a month ago or last year in school, but essentially, as long as we're telling the story of Charlie Joe Jackson and his friends, they're the same age. Now, the last Charlie Joe Jackson book does take place on the day of his middle school graduation. The whole book takes place on one day. And so at that point, the series is ending. I feel like, I can reveal that he's about to graduate from middle school. I can wrap everything up. But this was, this had been 9 books at this point, and struggling to find ways to tell about kids who are the same age for 9 books to me was a real struggle. Jeff Kinney's on.
At this point now, are you filled with regret and wish that you had left it open for more books yet to come?
I don't think so. I was done with it. I think the publisher had also felt that like enough was enough. It was a nice library of books. Jeff Kinney is writing his 13th and his 14th Wimpy Kids. God bless a guy who can keep characters fresh who are essentially the same age for that long. It's impressive. And Crimebiters is done with the 4 books. So Crimebiters was slightly different because I did know it was going to be a 3-book series kind of right off the bat. So I knew, but they were going to be kind of, since that was kind of a mystery series, could just regenerate storyline through new bad guys and new crimes and new ways to solve these mysteries. I didn't have that luxury with Charlie Joe because there was no real mystery or adventure part to it. These were just kids living their lives. It was a little harder to come up with interesting storylines. These guys Crimebiters always have foils and they have villains, and so it was a little easier to kind of make that almost an anthology series because each story is its standalone mystery that they have to solve.
And are there? I'm just chuckling because you mentioned that Charlie Joe Jackson is 9 books in total, and I'm thinking, yes, for the reluctant reader who started early on, I don't want to read 8 books later.
Yeah, they've got a whole library of books.
You're a reader now, son.
I know you don't want to talk about it yourself, but you've written series too, and so you must kind of find some of the same obstacles I've dealt with. Some of the same challenges.
Kind of. With Banneker Bones, the idea was, I call it the end-then story because there isn't really an ending. I'm working on the 3rd book now that will resolve quite a bit of things from the 2nd and 1st book, but leaving the door open for 4, 5, and 6, or however many. Eventually I'll expire, and then that's it. We're done. But otherwise, it's an open-ended plan, and my thought there was, let's make a character that I know I'm always going to be interested in, and so it's Batman at age 11. There's a lot of distinctions, but it's very much, here's our crime hero. There can always be another villain. I will always be able to come up with somebody for Banneker Bones and Ellicott Skullworth to fight against. And ways to raise the ante. And so the important thing was in book 1, just not to rule out future possibilities. Yep. Whereas with something like the Book of David, which is a 5-volume serial novel, that is one total story. I count it as 5 books, and you would too if you'd written and revised and re-revised it. I don't know how many drafts we did of each of those for 5 books. But it is one continuous story, which is why you can also buy the mega volume that if you drop it, it'll break your foot.
Did you map out that story in advance and kind of know where the book breaks would be?
I knew the ending. I'm a big fan of doing something I call it a grocery list. It's basically, okay, well, in order for, I usually have some idea of the ending. It doesn't always happen the way I foresee it. And in that case, the ending changed a little bit dramatically. Not that I could talk about it without spoiling. If I just wanted to tell you on a free podcast, I wouldn't have written 5 books. But because I knew the ending, I thought, okay, well, here's some major events that have to come along. And I decided relatively early on that it was going to be 5 volumes of serial. So I had to come up with 5 pretty good cliffhangers, or 4 pretty good cliffhangers, to make sure that we got you all the way to the 5th book, but also to make sure that each one was a little bit self-contained. They're the same characters on the same overall arc, but they have individual arcs and plots to be resolved within each volume of the series. And again, chapter 1 is available to download free as an ebook as you're listening to this.
Excellent.